Welcome everybody. We'll get underway earlier than usual, and I do expect that more and more people will come in as we go along. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Natasha Hamilton-Hart from Auckland University Business School, who I saw in a Centre for Security seminar at Auckland in Wellington late last year, and was really very impressed with your contribution. So I'm delighted that you've come here to Wellington and also given this talk in Auckland on Anglo-American capitalism in an East Asian mirror. I've just finished reading Parag Khanna's The Future is Asian, and I must say that is indeed what I think. And the other thing I think is that we know very, very little about Asia and East Asia. So I'm really going to be very interested in what you have to tell us, Natasha. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Hamilton-Hart.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm really glad to be here and good to see you. And I'm impressed by the setup you have for recording. Am I at the right volume? I feel right. All good. So let me start with just a little bit of an overview, if I can make this work. Which way around is this? There we go. And the sort of context is that, as all of you would be aware, a lot of Western countries, particularly the English-speaking countries, have had something of a sort of what's often called a populist backlash against international business, against elites, and perhaps particularly liberal elites, and I'll come back to why that might be. And my overall conclusion in terms of my talk today is that I think this backlash has something to do with the loss of state capacity to deliver some key public goods. But I will start with the observation that I'm not an expert in Anglo-American capitalism. My work has mostly been in Southeast Asia and somewhat on the rest of East Asia as well. And I was sort of interested in why East Asia as a region has largely not seen this kind of populist backlash against capitalism, against elites, and so on. I mean, they have plenty of other populist movements, but not this sort of distinctively discontent with international business, discontent with sort of incumbent liberal elites, as identified here. And so, one of the reasons I think, or at least I will try to persuade you, is that this may have something to do with the different state systems that preside over the capitalism that has developed in the region. And I'm going to talk about three different aspects of these state systems, first in East Asia, and secondly with a little look at the Anglo-American world in comparison, and looking at the socio-economic basis of regime support, at the legal system, and at the state organization itself, the bureaucracy. And it seems to me that the Anglo-American states are sort of by design struggle to deliver public goods that particularly of the kind that would raise economic productivity and involve overcoming collective action problems. This one is a bit sticky. Oh, I turned it off completely. How do I get it back? Oh, going back to the beginning. Right, so the populist backlash, which I think very dramatically hit the headlines with the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and the Brexit vote that happened that year, and it seemed to be a real rejection of elite leadership in the United Kingdom and the US, but you've also seen sort of popular movements elsewhere. And there's a long list of economic grievances that many people have pointed to as to why this might be. And they all have some basis that you can find empirically, rising inequality, unaffordable housing, the stagnating incomes for those in the bottom half of the income distribution, and a whole lot of public goods sort of problems around climate change, the environment, infrastructure. We know only too well. I think these economic issues are real, but they don't actually provide us a great deal of answer for understanding the backlash. And I think there are two elements I'd like to start with. And one is the fact that the patterns of economic disadvantage do not actually correspond that well with the actual people who voted for Trump or for Brexit. Thank you. And secondly, one of the very common explanations for why, the discontent, the economic grievances leading to the backlash is often prefixed around a supposed decline in social spending. But in fact, what we see is that despite the austerity that is often referred to, 2008, social spending is actually very high. And let me just briefly mention that, so with regard to the Trump vote, it is not accurate to say that the Trump vote, either in 2016 or it appears in 2018, 2020, when he actually, larger numbers of people voted for him the second time. These were not particularly poor people. Particularly, and there's some disaggregated data that's come through from 2016. If you looked at the income of your representative Trump voter compared to the local income of that person's place of residence, these are actually people who are moderately well off in the state that they were living in. So they were not at the bottom of the heap at all. These were people who actually had quite a stake in the status quo. And in fact, what we see is clearly a sort of education and values sort of divide. The quote, I don't know how legible it is to you, but the one underneath the map that sort of says, and this is the view from an academic who's actually, as you can probably tell from the tone, quite remote and somewhat dismissive of the sort of lack of education or lack of sophistication of the Trump voter. And there's certainly a difference, but it's clearly not one that can be read off an economic grievance sort of list. And it's somewhat similar with the Brexit vote in Britain, because although there was a clear support for Brexit from the less well-off parts of Britain, actually when they disaggregated the income breakdown of people who voted for Brexit versus not, although there is some association with income, in fact it's not nearly as great as the aggregate figures suggest. And I think it's also probably the case that, as we've seen in the 2009 of the Labour vote and the Red Wall, actually a lot of these voters were not, in terms of what their purchasing power of their local income would be, were again not the worst off. But again, we see differences, much bigger differences around age, around education, and some registers of value. So what does this have to do with the government spending part of it? I think that, one of the things I'd like to put to bed is that the grievance that may exist on the economic front is driven by a loss of state social spending. And this gives you two snapshots of federal spending in the US, one in 1962 and one in 2014. So this is pre-COVID and the massive blowout in public spending last year. But you can see, and actually overall, as a percentage of GDP, there's no decline across this period of time. But you can see that in 1962, military spending took nearly half of all public spending. And you have a bit of a chunk, the dark blue is Social Security, And the mid-blue is income security, but largely there's not a great role for transfer payments, social insurance payments back then. Correspondingly, in the modern era, 2014, the military percentage has declined significantly, and you have huge increases in health. You can't even see practically the health spend in 1962. It's a tiny slice, and now it's become huge. And income security and social payments have actually increased, even though it's known that the US welfare system is not that generous, but as a percentage of government spending, it has, the social spend has increased significantly. Similar for the UK, the graph shows you the percentage of public spending over time, and it actually goes back right to the beginning of the century, so you can see the increase in the world wars. But despite a sort of wobble around the sort of liberalization and later years of sort of the Thatcher era and since, as a percentage of GDP, the public spend is significant. And again, the social spend, the transfer payments are very, very large. So I'm not saying there aren't people who are missing out, they clearly are, but the level of which the public spend is already directed to redistribution of one sort or another, whether it's for health, whether it's for income transfers or other kinds of spending, it already takes a very large percentage of government spending. What there isn't very much of on that chart is anything that might be called economic development spending. You could say education spending has an economic development function, and there's a bit in there for transport, but these are actually relatively modest. So if there isn't a sort of easy explanation around economic grievance and the lack of social spending, the next most common explanation is, well, what about those culture and values differences? And I think that people on the left have tended to dismiss them as saying this is somehow a culture war whipped up by the right. I think that actually makes it too easy. There is disinformation, there has been manipulative use of things like immigration, but there's also quite a bit of evidence that there are actually quite significant divergence in morality and what is understood as moral action. And they do map partly along these political divides of sort of the Trump voter versus the Democrat Party voter and the Brexit voter versus the Remain vote in the EU. And work by my former fellow classmate at Cornell, Rawi Abdulal, has shown that when you compare the discontent in France with that of the US and other places, that actually France, over time, over the long run, after tax and transfers, inequality has declined over the last 30 years, which is quite different from the Anglo world. But they were still out, the Gilets jaunes were still out voicing their discontent with the elites. And he says this is around a lack of dignity. So it's all very well paying people so that they can keep body and soul together and live, but they don't have the dignity of work, and that France has failed to deliver the kind of productive increases to its economy that would provide people with the jobs and meaning and dignity and respect in their societies. I think that the moral divide is important, but then I think we've got to ask, how did it come about? Because I don't think it was purely an artifact of right-wing manipulation. And it's also, we've got to ask, how did these deficits in public goods provision come about? To the extent that we haven't been able to develop the infrastructure, the productivity increases, the kinds of investments that might make good jobs and meaningful work more viable, why has that happened? So let's see how it looks in Singapore, which is a sort of archetypal Singaporean it's this archetypal developmental state, and I'll talk about that term in a few minutes. But if we go to the sort of same government spending chart and say, what does the Singapore government spend its money on? And this is a graphic that they produced, the pie chart. And the thing I will point out is that the blue section, which looks quite large, and they call it social development. But if you dig into that social development part of the pie chart, it's actually got almost no transfer payments in it. The biggest component is education, followed by health, which I guess is a sort of, consumed at an individual level. That transfer payments are tiny, and they are hidden, I think, in the culture, community, and youth section of that list. And there are a lot of things in the social development that we would understand as economic development: manpower, communications, environment and water, and something called national development, which is a mix of social spending and other kinds of more economic things. And then the economic development chunk, which is significant, that is a far bigger proportion of government spending that is explicitly devoted to economic development action. And then you've got a pretty big chunk on the military and security, because they take that quite seriously too. I was going to show this animation, but I think I won't. It's a 1-minute animation. It tells you how, from 2010 to 2018, pre-COVID, which ministries have spent the Singapore budget. And I think it's very important to note that the spending does go through a small set of ministries, and I'll come back to that. If we did play the animation, you would see that the top two remain constant. It is always education and defence, with transport and other things coming up quite high as well. This is, as I said, Singapore is an example of a developmental state, and it's a pretty widely known term about the style of state intervention and activism in parts of East Asia. It is a sort of archetype, and there's a certain amount of variation even among the countries that I've considered more developmental in that blue bubble. And it certainly doesn't characterize the whole region, because there are others that would definitely be called perhaps more patrimonial, is the term I will use, and I'll get into some of the differences in a minute. But these would be the sort of typical ways in which East Asian countries have delivered accelerated economic growth to actually quite a large section of their population, such as there have been real wage increases over 2 generations that are, have really transformed what these countries did. The patrimonial states have a sort of less glittering record. There's a few more bumps and flaws along the way, but nonetheless, if you look at the human development indicators, they have all actually delivered very big increases in human development as well. Here are just a few pictures to walk you through Singapore's evolution. What I think will come up in your top left, is an early finance minister from Singapore standing on the ground of what is now Jurong Town Corporation, Jurong Mall probably, or some of the factories around there. If you've been to Singapore, this is now fully developed as an industrial, commercial and residential area. That's what it looked like before the Economic Development Board of Singapore decided that they would invite the multinational corporations in, and to make it enticing, they didn't just offer them tax breaks. They said, well, we will turn the swamp into factories. We will build the factories, we will build the roads, we will connect the power, we will build the worker housing, and we will take over the bus service to make sure the workers get there on time. So they played an enormously activist role in transforming Singapore. You can see Jurong Town Corporation buildings, factories that they built a bit later. And then, of course, some of the more recent stuff, the Biopolis, which they're huge investments in biotech industries. And the sort of latest one is a big EV center that's about to open again, out in Jurong, actually. So let me dig into what are the preconditions or the ways in which the state systems in East Asia have been structured to deliver this kind of economic transformation. As I said earlier, there are sort of 3 axes of variation that I will discuss, as I think they're all important dimensions in themselves. So let's look first at the the sort of socio-economic basis of regime support, which is really who does the government have to deliver to, and in what ways is it responsive? And one of the first things to note, of course, is that across the region, the left was defeated. Both the communist left and the non-communist left was comprehensively defeated by the end of the 1960s across the entire region. With varying degrees of brutality, there was significant labor repression that extended not just of unions, but of all social movements, really, that had any kind of a leftist orientation. The business sector was included, but in a very sort of organized way in the developmental states, and typically not so much as of right, but by invitation. And I think this makes a difference. And this is sort of summed up in some of the phrases that you would have heard, like Japan Inc. Embedded autonomy is another frequently used way to try and capture the business-government relationship, which was not one in which business represented its interests, saying this is what we're lobbying for in a organized way, and it's not that you have to take our notice, our interests into account, but that they did work out a very, mostly quite cooperative way of working together. Perhaps one of the motivating factors was that in most of these developmental states, there was a very strong security imperative to get it right. If you're in South Korea, you've got North Korea over the border. If you were in Taiwan, you've got China. Singapore, probably in a more imagined way, saw itself as surrounded by enemies. So very strong motives to develop industrially, connect to the world, and shore up their own performance. There was also, and I said the left was excluded, but there were actually significant elements of redistribution built into this. So there was land reform in the Northeast Asian cases that was quite important and sort of broke some of the old elite that might have got in the way of the developmental state. There's been huge investment in education across the region. And after a period of wage repression, there has also been, this has been followed by rising real wages. And of course, another element of redistribution of a sort is a sort of the captive savings that were forced on the population, which ended up meaning that wealth accumulation has occurred at a sort of more inclusive way than in New Zealand, for example. And I think another important factor is that because there was the developmental imperative and a commitment to work with business, they needed to make credible state commitments to protect property rights, which selectively they have done, as well as assurances that the savings that they were forcing people to accumulate in often state-controlled funds would not be eroded by inflation. Just a quick picture of the paths not taken. Does anyone recognize the person sitting next to Lee Kuan Yew? This is Lim Chin-siong, who was actually the real leader of the Barisan Socialists. He was the real leftist who had the grassroots support. He would have taken Singapore in a very different direction. He was locked up in prison. And then, of course, that is Sukarno, who was Indonesia's flamboyant first president, who flirted with the Communist Party, and that's Aidit, the leader of the Communist Party. And of course, Indonesian communism was extinguished with mass murder in the mid-60s. So these were definitely, there was a cutoff in any kind of incorporation or representation of leftists in an organized way. Let me touch on the other axis of variation, which is the varieties of law. And I'll just say that all across the region you'll hear quite a lot about law, and they refer to it quite routinely. What you have in the more developmental states is what many people have referred to as legalism. So this is not rule by law, it's not rule of law, but it's rule by law. And the other states, you would see something a bit more like routinized illegality or legal pluralism, possibly in Indonesia, with customary law making a comeback. And the state organization. So again, in the more developmental states, you see what is often referred to as sort of a rational, legal, Weberian archetype. And it actually sounds like the civil service that we had for much of the 20th century until the state sector reforms that became bedded down from the late 80s onwards. So very centralized, systematic coordination, a lot of record keeping, highly organized, career civil service, depersonalized bureaucratic office, so that the office becomes more important than the actual individual that is holding it, and a sort of merit-based civil service with a certain amount of ethos, sort of self-sustaining ethos. The patrimonial states in the region don't look like that at all, really. Quite a lot of personalization of office, quite a lot of patronage that's sort of within the bureaucracy and connecting the bureaucracy to the rest of the country, and a lot of sort of personal loyalties determining how the government actually works in practice. So quite a big deviation here. And you can actually find lots of quite irregular personal fiefdoms, very poor record keeping often, and this all creates a sort of not a very organized, disciplined hierarchy, and quite a lot of off-budget activity. So this explains the more flawed implementation of a lot of development policies in the more places like Indonesia and the Philippines. So how do we look on these three axes? And apologies if the font is a little small, but let me run through the socioeconomic basis of regime support. Obviously, we've seen a fall in the influence of organized labor in all of the English-speaking world. And the left parties, the New Zealand's Labour Party, British Labour Party, or the Democrat Party, have moved from class to cause-based sort of organisation and constituencies. And in fact, Piketty and his colleagues have termed this a sort of system of multi-elite politics. So both the left and the right are, their main constituencies and their leadership is very much around an elite, an educated elite in the case of the Democrats and the left, and a sort of property-owning elite in the case of the right. We also have very pluralist policy-making systems where, by design, very particularistic interests are embedded in the policy process. So very much, and very much as of right. It's a representative, sort of not by invitation necessarily, but because these people have sort of, the certain right to mobilize and to present their case and make representations to policymakers. There are a few other sort of obvious things that many people have talked to, the rising cost of campaign finance. It's interesting that both the left and the right are committed to welfare spending because these are consumer-based capitalist economies, and that is why the social spending, the transfer payments, have been sustained regardless of whether you've actually got a Conservative government or a Labour government. And as we well know, since the late 80s, a sort of selective liberalisation, but also a lot of rent-seeking and a lot of rents in the economy as well. The legal system, I think, in contrast to the legalism of the developmental states, there is genuinely rule of law. That is, law is a constraint on government, often a very frustrating one, but it is real nonetheless. And in fact, I think it has increased over the last 30 years as, by design, a lot of what you could consider political decision-making has moved into either the courts or into independent regulatory agencies and other sorts of quasi-judicial sort of independent government organizations like the Human Rights Commission and others, where these sorts of decisions now are often being taken out of the political sphere, whether it's around monetary policy settings or the organization of the electricity market, are getting much more delegated and sort of handed over to technocrats and, in some cases, the courts. If we look at the third column around state organization, of course, New Zealand led the world as the country that shifted from rowing to steering is the metaphor that is often used. The regulatory state, which is a term I prefer rather than neoliberal, which is often also used. But in fact, because what it meant is the state didn't withdraw from the marketplace, it became not an active provider, but a regulator of privatized entities that would deliver the services, whether that was water or electricity or public works or whatever it is. As I said, the independent regulatory agencies are pervasive in the Anglo-American world. They don't really exist in the developmental states in East Asia. There have been a few experiments and agencies with similar sounding names, but in fact, there has not been this separation. Within the agencies themselves, what we see in New Zealand and other Anglo states is a very extensive sort of commitment to what is often called managerialism. So rather than a hierarchical, command-based traditional bureaucracy, you see, key performance indicators and an internal sort of simulated market which operates, so for instance, across our health system. In some countries, they've gone further doing that with the education system, where you have a lot of contractualism, rules around how you operate and how you need to run this. And along with that has gone a lot more lateral entry and turnover, higher rates of turnover, and sort of a more permeable civil service sphere. This is just a visual representation of the emergence of the multi-party elite. This is actually New Zealand, which shows that the gap between the wealthiest and the most educated, it used to be that the elites voted national and other aligned policies, and now there's been basically the more educated you are, you're more likely to vote Labour. And this is similar to what has happened, same trend in France and the US, where you see the Democrats becoming the party of the educated elite and the Republicans the party of the property-owning elite. This graphic is done by Piketty. The previous one was by Gethin, I should acknowledge that. So if we turn to the state organization, this is a picture of Taiwan's, and basically you can read the entire structure of the Taiwanese government on one page on their website that they very kindly provide in English. And it divides everything out functionally. You can expand each of these ministries and it will tell you which agencies they control. It's there in one place. On the other side of the slide, you have my attempt to do the same thing for New Zealand. And initially, when you go to the Public Service Commission and you try and get the structure of the government, you get Buller District Council next to something that is completely unrelated. There's no sense of how these parts fit together or how they work or who's in charge. They do slightly better than that, but nonetheless, we're still left with the actual real finding that the New Zealand structure of the organization of the state is incredibly fragmented. And I've done a sort of systematic comparison with Singapore here. If we look at the numbers of ministers, they're not perhaps too different. There are 20 individual people who have ministerial appointments in Singapore, whereas New Zealand has 26. That was on the ministerial list at the end of 2020, and that was including 4 outside cabinet. Ministerial portfolios look quite different, though. It depends a bit how you count them, but I would say there are 26 for Singapore, and that's if you exclude the second ministers, which are sort of the ministers in training. But that includes 3 coordinating ministers. They have one who is there to coordinate on the economic front, one for the security front, one for the cultural front. All the ministers have a ministry, and most of them only have one ministry. So it's a very organized, efficient distribution of portfolios. Now, in New Zealand, we have twice the number of ministerial portfolios, and notably, many of the portfolios have no ministry in any obvious way. Some of them cover multiple ministries, and some of them cover just little bits of a ministry. But quite frequently, I mean, things like child poverty, there are ministerial portfolios for things that do not belong to any particular discrete ministry. And that actually has consequences for how the delivery, the implementation of whatever it is the minister is meant to be responsible for can actually be accomplished. The statutory boards, authorities, crown agencies, non-public service departments, there are a whole variety of these, autonomous crown entities, independent crown entities, and things like that. I tried to count like for like, and I think that 59 is the number for Singapore of these things. And the striking thing is every single one of them is very explicitly under the authority of a ministry. And that you go to the ministry's front page and it will say, these are our agencies. Now, in practice, some of them might have a very high degree of de facto autonomy. So I'm not saying they defer to the permanent secretary on a daily basis, but they do relate very clearly to a ministry, which relates very clearly to a minister. I counted 71 of these things for New Zealand, and most of them don't actually come under the authority of any ministry at all. They just sort of float around. Quite often they relate to a certain minister. There will be, especially if they were set up by legislation. But it's extraordinarily, and these include our key development agencies. This includes New Zealand Trade and Industry. This includes Callaghan Innovation, which doesn't even tell you what it does. Thanks, Mr. Callaghan, but they're just sort of out there, unintegrated, not working cohesively together and not clearly accountable. Then the other categories, research institutes and other crown entities. And I haven't even fully counted. So, I counted the district health boards, for instance, as one, but of course we've got 20. So again, one could add, you can count in different ways, but you get the overall picture is that we have, for the same size population, we have many, many more ministries and agencies and portfolios, and it is much less organized. And as a sort of concluding point, I think this raises the question of, we had a pretty capable state, and it was developed in an earlier era. In fact, a lot of the Western state systems developed their core competencies and organizations in the 19th century, at a time of very restricted franchise. Sweden is one of the countries shown on the chart, which shows the extension of the franchise in Sweden. And the quote from Piketty is that he says, the modern centralized state came very early in Sweden, at a time when Sweden actually politically not only had a restricted franchise, but it allocated more votes on the basis of how wealthy you were. So the wealthier the richer you were, the more votes you got. So quite an extreme form of anti-democracy. That was the organization that was created for the elite, which was then used, very famously, to deliver Sweden's social democracy of the 20th century. This is speculative, but if we look at Piketty's famous wealth charts over time, this is Britain from the 1780 to 2015, and you can see the known sort of increase in share of the top 1% and the top 10% and the declining share of the bottom 50%. My hunch is that, we're obviously not back at the end of the 19th century in terms of the distribution of wealth, but we are clearly somewhat moving in that direction, and the changes of the 80s and 90s brought about a dramatic shift in the distribution of property in Britain, but also in other countries. It's more extreme, actually, in the US. It may be coincidental, but it may not, that this shift in economic policy, which is the most obvious way in which wealth got redistributed as a result of the liberalizing economics or selectively liberalizing economic policy, coincided with the deliberate creation of a state system which would not actually be capable of implementing certain kinds of public policies. And that this has been a project not just of the political right, but the political left, which has been just as keen, in my view, to create insulated state agencies and a sort of more atomized conception of the public sphere, and that, in a multi-elite system, both of them have seen in their interests to wall off areas of public policy from popular demands that could be delivered through the, voiced through the electoral system, because you can't go back to the, the restricted franchise of the 19th century. So this is another way, I think, of trying to deliver that. And I'm not saying that was done deliberately for those purposes, but it certainly has the coincidental effect. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Natasha, right. The floor is open for questions. Anybody? Would anybody like to start with the questions for, yeah. Anyone want to go? Well, yeah, Jeff?
Yeah, well, you started off by worrying about why East Asia has a different flavour to it than the Americans. I can't help feeling that you need to start from big picture history. The original core of the global economy and the imperial nations, all of that stuff on a failing trajectory is the distribution of global wealth and income, and production moves off to what used to be the periphery, which is now essentially the core of the new capitalist system. Being in the winning coalition is different from being in the losing coalition. It has a whole lot of dimensions to it. Some of them are economic and social, a lot of them are to do with the sense of the place in the world, your social groups place in the world, your organisation's place in the world, are you a winning or a losing firm, a winning or a losing country? Surely one has to give some thought to the way that the dynamic of capitalism is shifted. And as the core has relocated, what's gone with the core is a sense of purpose and confidence and participation in a viable enterprise. And where the core has shifted from, you have a more enemy, lack of identity with a successful enterprise, and more scope for division, fragmentation, and so on. And it seems to me that the whole ideological program that's gone through in Anglo-America of fragmenting and disintegrating what used to be quite a satisfactory state system. New Zealand was much more like a development state 30, 40 years ago. You look at your typologies, but we deliberately taken it away. It's really to do with the historical momentum and the balance of power across the global system. How about that?
It might, but then I would say, why did the core of the capitalist world shift to East Asia? Now you could say, well, it wasn't going to go to South America because it didn't have the population base, but the performance of South America has not been the same as East Asia. It also, maybe you could say, well, Africa didn't have the population base, but we haven't seen a comparable developmental buoyancy in Africa. India has had the population base, but has not become the China. And so I think that the capitalist success, you could say the shift in the center of gravity of the world's economy, which undoubtedly has shifted to East Asia and is continuing to, that didn't happen automatically, and there are other parts of the world that have definitely, you could have said in terms of human resources, population might have met some of those criteria, but they didn't. And in terms of being on the winning side, well, the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and people like Fukuyama were saying that was the end of history, the West won. Now, maybe that was prideful and silly at the time, but, I think there was a real moment in which the US really had a position of global primacy, and the West was ascendant. The West won. So, only a short time later, we look pretty ragged, and the US looks in tatters, perhaps from some perspectives. But I don't think so. I think that what you're describing is an end point, which I don't think would have been predicted in 1985. Or 1975.
I'd like to just make a couple of comments, I think. I do think 1987 in New Zealand was a fracture point when, I mean, speaking, I remember reading economic management on the Labour Party photocopier the Monday after the election in typescript and thinking, what have we done here? And I think the other dimension that maybe is pertinent is the difference in culture between East Asian, particularly developmental societies, and the Western model, particularly, and as that has developed. So we stress individual human rights. Those Asian cultures stress common rights. And if you look at what's happened in China, where they've lifted however many 100 million people out of poverty, compared with what's happening in the United States at the moment, or indeed in Britain, where people are starting to struggle more and more. There's a important cultural element in there on the one hand, and there was perhaps that neoliberal, I forget your term for it, sorry, regulatory, because it was deregulatory, wasn't it?
I don't think it was actually as deregulatory as it proclaimed.
Okay, all right. But just two things then: the cultural differences and the fracture that happened in that sort of wave that swept the world in the late 80s, or perhaps in the early 80s, with the going off the gold standard and.
Yeah, I think culture, one can find many differences, both between Asia and the Anglo-American world, and within Asia, of course, as well, many different cultures. I think, the huge emphasis on education and the collective seems to be a very common and important aspect of many East Asian societies that is, you could say, culturally embedded. But then that is also, it's not enough to have a cultural commitment to educational excellence and a sort of very competitive and quite harsh education system, because you also have to fund it, and it has to deliver successful education programs. So the enormous spending on education in Singapore, which is highly effective. I lived and worked in Singapore for 10 years and sort of taught the products of that school system. And they came out actually incredibly well equipped to be independent thinkers, in my view. And we're far too dismissive of the educational system as there as only being about rote learning. I think that's prejudice. So I think that is important, but then you have to have a toolkit, you have to have an administrative system to deliver on that. The collective action thing, I think, is an important one. And I don't want to attribute it just to culture, because again, I think that the capacity of the business sector, I've just been working with my colleague Frank Seedlock, and we looked at Taiwan and its response to the COVID pandemic, and particularly the demands of increasing mask production, and we showed that not only was there a very centralized coordinating role for the government, but there was also a really comprehensive kind of systems of cooperation among the Taiwanese firms themselves that were willing to share technology, willing to donate their workers, willing to make investments, and it took both the government and the business, a lot of cooperation to do that. I don't think that's just culture. I think you have to have the institutions that allow that to happen, and those are, around the legal system. You can't go around accusing them of being a cartel or breaking the, and also the bureaucracy itself. So I think you're right. Those things are, there is a larger cultural dimension to it, but I think that then needs to get, organized in a state system.
When the whole of the world manufactures its food in a barrel. The different systems of social organisation and different cultures work better at different points in technological development?
I honestly haven't thought about it in those terms. Yeah. And I think Israel would actually, I don't know very much about Israel, but my impression is that it would tick quite a few of those developmental state boxes, including the security imperative, of course. I think there are often people who say that, as you move from catch-up technologies into the frontier of wherever the technological world is headed, and you actually then need to have an innovative capacity rather than just a sort of copying capacity. And some people have argued that this calls for a different system of state support, different kinds of organizational capacities, different ways of working. And I think that when we look at the remaking of the developmental states in, say, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, as they've moved from catch-up to frontier technologies such as robotic, artificial intelligence, biotech, it's not that they've taken the same model that they had from the 60s and are rolling it out along all of these new technologies. There have been changes to the organizations that work with industry, and particularly as industry has become much more independent and has much more resources and is much more globally connected. So I think you do see a fine-tuning of that model. I don't personally see its wholesale abandonment at all, and I also don't see it as being that radically changed. To me, the continuities are actually quite striking, even with the shift in technologies. And I think there was perhaps a bit of a wish fulfillment among many English-speaking political economists and economists who looked at Singapore and Korea and said, well, okay, well, you succeeded at catch-up, but if you're going to innovate, you're going to have to be, you're going to have to be much more liberal, and you're going to have to give people much more individual autonomy and human rights. And I actually don't see that much sign of it. I mean, Taiwan and South Korea and Singapore have all liberalized politically. China certainly hasn't. And yet the technological capacity of China to produce cutting-edge industrial products, including in all these new frontier technologies, I think we would be very short-sighted to write them off and say this can never happen because you need to have a kind of liberal democracy to deliver that. I mean, I think if you look at how they're gearing up in the face of the cutoff of access to advanced chip technology and some of the software cutoffs that have either been in place or practiced, I think China's going to make it. With a very centralized state system and without the political liberalization. I mean, whether that happens, that might happen as well, but I don't think it's a precondition. So yeah, it's an intriguing question, and I haven't thought it through properly, but yeah.
Are they less ideological than we are? I think it was Deng Xiaoping who said, doesn't matter what colour the cat is as long as it catches the mouse. Have we been kind of hog-tied by ideology? Yeah.
Famously, Singapore's political leadership, both Lee Kuan Yew and his finance ministers, Goh Keng Swee and others, Singapore's ideology is pragmatism. We don't have one. We'll, whatever works. Very similar to the Deng Xiaoping phrase. I mean, everyone has an ideology in a way, right? I mean, there are values embedded in this, and there are understandings of what is appropriate, and of course they exist everywhere. You don't have such a thing as a blank slate. It is difficult for me to understand the shift in New Zealand and across the English-speaking world in terms of ideology. And it's not because I'm a closet Marxist, but it's because the same people who were in positions of influence in the 70s and first half of the 80s suddenly became converted and started saying and speaking very different things. And it seems to me that you could call that an ideological shift, and it certainly describes a different mindset across those two periods. But, I guess it depends what you think an ideology is, because the intellectual conversion and the intellectual argumentation around it was really lightweight. I mean, you read economic management, this is not even economics 101, right? This is the most hackneyed, oversimplified version of, one idea from economics. It was deeply influential and it was useful. But, one of my projects on the back burner is to say, look, it doesn't even pass the state sector reforms that were supposedly dictated by an economic ideology. You can go to transaction cost economics and say, apply what Coase was writing in 1932 about the theory of the firm and why firms exist as efficient hierarchical organizations that, command this unit will do that, because under certain circumstances that is more efficient than market-based exchange. Well, that set of economic ideas was on the shelf and had a lot of prestige associated with it. It was accepted, transaction cost economics, which has grown since. So why do you choose one version of that, and that becomes influential rather than another set of economic ideas that was equally available and in my view, more intellectually robust? But
Since my two mates have both spoken and they're more ignorant than I am, I feel confident to speak now. Sorry, that's a joke. I just had a thought, and I wanted to put it out there just for your response, and then a question. I'll put the question first. So the question is, forgetting Singapore, because it's a bit unusual, but South Korea and Japan and Taiwan, are their per capita incomes higher than in Western Europe and North America? And are they projected to have is there projected to be an increasing gap in wealth? In other words, they overtake Western Europe and North America? That was my question. And the observation was, I remember reading something when Walter Nash was the Prime Minister and Lee Kuan Yew visited him. And he talked about, I think Singapore's GDP per capita was, a fraction of ours in the 1950s, and Lee Kuan Yew said that when Singapore is a rich country, we'll have welfare like you do, but we're just poor. And then the way it was described is that as Singapore got richer, they looked at what the Germans did and compared that to what the British Labour Party did in terms of welfare, and they decided they'd rather have a more corporatist, Germanic approach to development of society. So I don't know why I'm nervous, because I've got this thing in my hand, but so my question really was, do you think the East Asian countries were perhaps influenced by the European Union and the Christian Democrats after they rebuilt Europe after the war and relative to the British Labour Party's approach of, particularly in terms of welfare?
that is an interesting question, and I think the welfare policies in East Asia actually seem to be very different from even the sort of, what I understand to be the West European model. And I hadn't heard that story about Lee Kuan Yew and his exchange in New Zealand, but Lee Kuan Yew wrote and spoke at length about his disdain for welfarism and how, that the West had basically permitted all this laziness and, unwed mothers and all of these things that were sort of leading to its decline. And Singapore's pension system and the Central Provident Fund, which is a mandatory state-backed savings scheme which employees and employers have to contribute to, and at times at very high rates, so we talk about 3% KiwiSaver contribution if you want. At times the contribution has been required of 20% for employees, and it's variable for employers with the state of the economy, but at times it can be a really big chunk. And that was expressly designed as a way of individualizing, incentivizing, forcing them to save, but also to avoid paying the enormous amounts that we pay all across the West in pensions. And, they have got creeping welfare here and there, and especially under COVID, of course, they've done a huge amount of sort of social spending. But compared to any other part of the world, the social spend has been very low, and even with aging populations, it has crept up a little bit, particularly in Japan, but remains much more around the family and the individual, but not left for them to do voluntarily, So I think I don't know whether that was an explicit borrowing from Switzerland or somewhere. I honestly haven't heard that, but I think it grew out partly because the role, at least in Singapore and Malaysia, those centralized savings weren't just a way of providing for public welfare in the future, but they were actually recycled through the financial system and funded development at home as well. So a lot of that was actually then captured by government policies one way or the other as well. So they sort of, and I have a feeling that that was the greater imperative at the beginning, at any rate, and then later they developed a very strong anti-welfare sort of rhetoric, particularly in Singapore. But yeah, it's an interesting question as to whether they consciously followed a sort of Swiss-type model or not.
What about the projections for per capita income in East Asia compared to North America?
So per capita income has obviously risen enormously. The trends in inequality are, the more you dig into how they've constructed the Gini coefficients, the more caveats you have to add. 15 years ago, Singapore had a Gini coefficient of 55, which is very unequal. They have miraculously now brought this down to 35 through, I mean, if you dig into it, basically excluding the rich and excluding the poor. The Northeast Asian developmental states, where they did have significant agrarian reform, land reform, immediately after World War II, it seems genuinely have relatively equal Gini scores compared to much of the rest of the world. And although they have become more unequal, they have not become as unequal. So that's Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. The Southeast Asian states have always been more unequal. And as I say, but there's so much depends on how you dig into how they got the data and how they're calculating it. I wouldn't take many of the Gini scores at face value, and I do get the impression that equality is genuinely, there is less inequality in the Northeast Asian developmental states, but the Southeast Asian ones, I think, reflecting that exclusion of the left and the failure of land reform, have actually been relatively unequal. But the inequality hasn't actually increased dramatically over the last 20 years. So yeah, it's a mixed story.
I mean, in a way, this has turned into a follow-up to that. My observation is, and I don't know how general it is, but I mean, just looking at Singapore, and you compare that to, say, European states other than the UK, where they have extensive social welfare systems, and I mean, to an extent, New Zealand, where we try to have a social welfare system, but have kind of killed it largely. But pay lip service to it. The Singapore ethos seems to be, or their way of working seems to be, they realise they need to keep people happy and reasonable, sufficient incomes and so on. And in a welfare state, you do that partly by providing jobs, but when people don't have jobs, then you have a sufficient welfare system to whatever, tie them over or whatever. In Singapore, they've really focused, their total focus is really on that national development. And it's industrial development, it's education, and they've been very good at providing jobs. I mean, I think their unemployment rate's something like 2% or something, you probably know better than me. And so they've been very, very good at just providing a high standard of living to people by providing work. A focus on work there. It's a kind of a very materialistic type of approach to life. Now, I'm not sure if it's quite the same in the other developmental states of East Asia, but I suspect there's something of that in them. And so it's kind of these two different ideas of how you keep people happy and stop them going off and forming communist parties and unions and things like that. You either relentlessly provide jobs, or you have a welfare state that tides over the failings of the market. And the question then arises, if that's the case, the question then arises, well, that was sort of what happened in the United States post-Second World War and probably going before that. What happens when these developmental states essentially run out of steam, because at some point their economic development their economic growth must slow down, and you'll think that it'll become more difficult to run that same kind of regime. Whether they will, at that point, have to start expanding their welfare states, their social security and all that kind of thing. So whether, I mean, in a sense, is that question, is this a developmental stage, or whether that's a viable alternative to what's happened in Europe?
I think it could, there's an element of it, but there being a developmental stage, and certainly you can't sustain economic growth at 8-9% per year indefinitely, and it's slowed significantly in, particularly, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. They're no longer rocketing along at those enormous rates of growth. I don't think, though, that it's just a matter of, well, they'll grow out of it and they'll be like us, because, I mean, that's been the prediction now for 30 years. And of course, many people read the Asian financial crisis of the late 90s as being the point at which proved that the Asian developmental state was outgrown, defunct, and didn't serve a purpose anymore. It was all, and what I actually think we've seen is that, and these are high-income countries now. I mean, not, because still Malaysia, Thailand, these are middle-income countries, but Singapore is wealthy, South Korea is wealthy. These are not low-income, catch-up, still going up the technology ladder. And I think what they have done is that they have been able to remodel some of the economic development agencies and some of the specific strategies to provide meaningful jobs. And in fact, they're all labor deficit countries. They import labor. And they've been able to do that because they do not spend more than half their state budget on income transfers. I mean, so transfer payments in the OECD, they just dominate. I mean, you say we don't have a welfare system, but boy, it costs a lot to not have a welfare system. The transfer payment spending is huge, and it means there just really isn't that much left over, to put into biotech or artificial intelligence or robotics or anything like that. Now, I don't think it's enough for us just to spend more on economic development, because I think what we do spend, we spend very ineffectively because of the fragmentation and because we try and replicate the market rather than actually compensate for the ways it doesn't work. But there's no doubt that having money in the kitty makes an enormous difference. Social spending has crept up in Japan quite significantly, and there's certainly pressures for it in other countries, but I think it doesn't seem to me that they're going to converge. It seems unlikely, but who knows in the longest term, in the long term, or even the medium term.
Hello. I'm a complete non-expert, but I just have a couple of thoughts that have occurred to me while listening to you. And to me, economic systems are like magic, the magical things. Things either work or they don't, and success is its own justification for a system. I think we're actually talking about China, so I'll address China, because China is the biggest thing that's going on at the moment, isn't it? When China was in its really down period at the end of the 1800s, all the Chinese intellectuals were thinking, why is the West so good? And they looked at the Western system and went, these must be the reasons: individualism, democracy, decentralization, freedom, and multiplicity of thought, and all those other things. So they went, we must copy them so we can have the same success. And it was seen that collectivism, central control, autocraticism, and government-directed thought were the cause of China's weakness and failure. And now it's flipped. I don't know why, and I'd have to read some more, but now individualism, democracy, decentralization, freedom of thought is the cause of the West's failure, and collectivism, central control, and government-directed thought is this magic formula.
So how did that happen? That's right. The other thing I have is, nations act like people, in my opinion. It's like this rational man, to me, doesn't exist, and the rational country doesn't exist. And all these theories of economics are just, to me, just personally, they are like magic. If it works, it's magic. If it doesn't work, it's just shit, basically. Success breeds confidence. China is confident. Failure breeds panic. The West is in panic. We are panicking. We in the West, we seem to have totally lost confidence ourselves and our systems and our history and everything about us. And, we're being attacked. Probably, completely correctly, we are being attacked by everyone that we... Yeah, I am wrapping up. I am wrapping up. We're being attacked as being fundamentally rotten and malevolent to the core from the very beginning up till now, and we're just getting our comeuppance. So we really need to look to China to solve our problems and go collectivist and just get rid of everything we believe in. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Is GDP really the source of a good life, and is it the be-end and end-all of everything?
Well, I don't know. If it's magic, then we could save a lot of money on the university system. That would be, a lot of economists would be out of a job. Look, there are fashions and intellectual fashions, and I'm reminded of the debate among Western scholars about Confucianism. Was it a cause of Chinese backwardness, or was it the reason why they, did so well? And both versions have been put on the table. So I think there obviously are fashions in terms of which explanations are favoured, and nothing succeeds like success. I don't think, though, that I would write off the East Asian developmental experience that easily, and that is because if you look at the condition of South Korea in 1954 at the end of the Korean War, it was in ruins. There was misery, and no one was predicting that that Korea was going to be a successful, thriving capitalist economy in 50 years. Actually, the Philippines looked much more promising at that point. And I think there is a real difference in the state elites and the state system that took Korea, yes, with American support and a conducive world trading system, but nonetheless, the Philippines had that too, didn't work out so well for them. And I do think that the state system, who the regime is answerable to, and the kind of legal system that they have, I think they made a difference. So I don't think it's just a matter of, projecting backwards with hindsight and saying, well, that was why we interpret it that way. I think one can try and, with care, state the ex-ante factors that might have helped explain the outcome.
Yeah, I remember being in Seoul a few years ago and thinking that very thing, that looking, what an amazing country, and thinking, 50 years ago it was devastated by that horrible war. Just one last question then. If for New Zealand going ahead, thinking, say, 10 years ahead, what might you say would be the most important lesson we might learn from what you see in the way the East Asian countries have developed?
I think the most important lesson might be that maybe we could open up our menu of who do we copy, it selectively, obviously, because we're not going to be Singapore, we're not going to be South Korea. But it's to be honest, it's quite depressing when I discover, and I came back to New Zealand 10 years ago after being away for 20 years, and that we're sort of still importing ideas and civil servants from the United Kingdom. It's like, surely we can pick some better role models. So I do think, in terms of who we choose from, we could actually look at some of the places that have succeeded rather than some of the places that seem to be failing. I do think the state of our civil service and public sector organisation is not on a good trajectory. I don't see any sign that there is actually any recognition of the problems. I mean, we talk a lot about, yes, we're fragmented and all of that, but if you look, I mean, the Public Service Act from 2020, it doesn't change anything. In fact, it makes several things worse, in my view. I don't see any, so I think that the state organization part of that, axis of the state, I don't see us going in a good direction on that. I think, if anything, so you can't change the politics. You can't just say, well, we want to have politics this way. But I do think that, in terms of thinking what is a viable political coalition that might demand the kind of policies and institutions that would more effectively deliver, I think that, surely there has to be something that is slightly more universalistic than the sort of very identitarian sort of communities, or, communities was the word that was used in the 2000s. I think the Public Service Act refers to groups, that this moves us away from universalistic sort of solutions around whether it's healthcare or economic development policy. And I don't know. I mean, there are cases to be made for that approach, but we've been trying something along those lines for 30 years now, and I guess to me, I think the onus should be on the people who want to say, yes, we need to do more of this fragmentation and more of this group-based, individualized, fragmented kinds of delivery mechanisms. I think that case, as time goes on and we don't build the houses and we don't build the infrastructure and we don't seem to be able to deliver the kind of high-quality jobs to enough of the population, I think the case should be, people need to say, well, something needs to change, and it can't just be more of the same, right? But
okay, well, on that note, thank you very much, Natasha. So, I do think we're at the end of an era, and we certainly need ideas from around the world and from different places, and certainly, in my view, more and more from the East. So, thanks very much. Please.
thank you.
Appreciate it.